So welcome everybody, welcome members of the Rifkind Seminar for the Humanities and Arts, welcome CCNY Dean and administrators, and welcome our guests at the Rifkind Center for the Humanities. I'm Michal Deckel, I'm the director of the Rifkind Center here at CCNY, or not here, or virtually at CCNY. The Rifkind Center is a humanities and arts center that hosts conferences and lectures and an interdisciplinary seminar and many other things. It is named after Simon Hirsch Rifkind, who was a United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York, and a trial lawyer and a human rights lawyer, and we are supported very, very generously by the Winston Foundation. And we thank them for that. I urge you to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter and on our website, which is rifkindcenter.org, for future events. Our next event, next public event after this one, is going to be an event where we talk about the healthcare system and the pandemic and inequalities, racial inequalities in the healthcare system in the light of the pandemic, and with Jonathan Metzl, who is the author of a very important book called Dying of Whiteness, and Dana Davis of the Graduate Center. So I'm thrilled to host Federico Finkelstein and Raj Menon, who will be his interlocutor and respondent. Now, as we said before, I don't know if those of you who just came in when was it? I guess March. Now I don't remember the exact date, right?
First week of March.
The first week of March, before everything in our life has changed, we hosted a conference on global populism. And at the time, we at the center were very concerned with the rise of populism in different forms, in different places, conceivably in different forms, but somehow connected. And we wanted to theorize that, and we had some wonderful speakers, including Federico. And then everything changed after that. So we wanted to hear back from Federico, more specifically about populism and as related to the pandemic. So I'm going to introduce Raj Menon, and then Raj will introduce you, Federico. Federico will speak, Raj will respond with some questions, and then we'll open the floor to audience questions, which you can type in the chat, and we can go on until about 2. So Raj Menon holds the Anna and Bernard Spitzer Chair in International Relations at the Powell School at the City College. He is our colleague here. And he holds many other esteemed positions at Columbia University, at the Carnegie Foundation, and elsewhere, which I won't get into because that will take a very long time. He's author of many books. His last ones are Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order, which he co-authored with Eugene Rumer, and The Conceit of Humanitarian Intervention, which came out with Oxford University Press. The first one was with MIT. Raj also writes all the time, seemingly, for The Nation and the New York Times and Foreign Policy, and the Los Angeles Times and Newsweek and so on. So I'm thrilled to have both of you here with us. And Raj, I will turn things to you.
Thank you, Michal. My mother would be so proud of that wonderful introduction. Thank you. It's good to be back at the Rifkind Center, and I note that Dean Eric Koch is here, so let me say, Eric, that you know that Andreas and Michal have given terrific direction to the center, the Rifkind Center. I noticed 81 participants. It's really a wonderful thing. I'd like to welcome back Professor Federico Finkelstein, whose lecture on populism I had the great pleasure of listening to about a year ago. Federico, it's very good to have you back at City College. And let me say a few words about your considerable accomplishments, and then I'll turn it over to you, and then I will ask a few questions, and then we'll go to Q&A, I think, which Michal will answer. I'll turn it back to her. Professor Finkelstein is the professor of history at the New School for Social Research. He did his PhD at Cornell University. He is the author of 7 books, which have been translated into multiple languages. His new book is alluringly titled A Brief History of Fascists, lies. Fascists lie? I'm shocked, Federico. Tell me that's not true. He is also a public intellectual of sorts. He's contributed widely to a variety of American and European newspapers and magazines. You will find that he's a provocative and incisive speaker. With that, Federico, I turn it over to you. Once again, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Raj, and also to Andreas and Michal for inviting me. As I said, I mean, this is really, I mean, it's really incredible to be back in a way in the context of your university, because in that, I mean, we had a really good discussion, a very memorable session, which I think I will always remember, because it was, as I said, the last conference I was, and even the last subway I took before, you know, changing life. I remain in New York City, but living in very different ways. And then the pandemic hit us, and the question is, I mean, or at least the question for me was, I mean, how this new world looks like the previous one, and to what extent, and perhaps even more worrying, this new world that we are living connects to a previous world which we were supposed to have left behind. And by that I mean the world of fascism, the world of dictatorship, and a world in which racism and discrimination were key elements for politicians to win. And that is something that in a way that sadly is sort of coming back. And that somehow shows that this new world that we are living is not, I wouldn't say that is, I mean, it's still different to the past, and yet it connects us to the past in ways that are pretty dispiriting and certainly a matter of concern. So, I mean, certainly for me, and I'm sure for the rest of you. During this period, I continue to think about this in the ways that I can. That is to say, as an historian of fascism and populism, and also as a person that just wrote a book on fascist lies. And the result of that, I will share with you today. I will tell you a little bit of how I see these historical patterns, and I will finish with trying to understand what's going on, and perhaps even from, let's say, from this big archive represented by the history of fascism and populism, what can we learn, how we can hopefully avoid terrible things that happened in the past, and terrible things that look as if they could happen again in the near future. So, I mean, that's what I will try to do today. And then for me, always the more fruitful part is listening from you. So I will try to be as brief as I can, which already being from Argentina is a very difficult task, because we are not necessarily famous for being, you know, succinct or to engage in brief conversation. So I will try nonetheless. So basically, last but not least, I want to repeat something that I said in the previous meeting, which is that it's a great pleasure to be talking in a public university such as the one that represented by CUNY and City College, because I mean, it is, I mean, talking about the future and what we need, I mean, this is exactly what we need, I think. This is, I studied in a similar university, the University of Buenos Aires, before coming to the US. And I think with all the difficult things that are happening to education in general, I think public universities perhaps are even more than in the past, I mean, the future, I think. Okay, so let me start. The idea is, the idea for me today is how to think historically, or how history can help us in order to understand the current crisis. And let me address perhaps like the elephant in the room, which is that some people say, the crisis that happened in the past, the crisis that created the conditions for authoritarianism or even fascism to emerge, were crises which were somehow manufactured. I mean, violence or the unrest was something that was created by the fascists or other authoritarians, and then they presented themselves as a response to that. And to some extent, this crisis of this COVID-19 crisis is not that. It was not manufactured in that way. It's a kind of crisis of natural causes, so to speak. But there is an element here that I see that is important, is that at the same time that is true, I think also the fact that the terrible this terrible pandemic was faced by, let's say, by acts of propaganda, lies, violence, and even racism, I think take us back to a dimension of it, which is a potentially fascist dimension of it, which is how the response to it was manufactured, certainly, and how this manufacture of lies and propaganda eventually created a situation on the ground, which was the outcome of that manufacturing of a crisis. So yes, this is a crisis of natural causes, of course, but it was increased, and to put it simply, a lot of people died, not because of the disease itself, but rather the lack of planning and the rejection of science denialism, and its replacement with a propaganda apparatus and things which are actually, to put it quite, I mean, to be quite blunt about it, things that look as if they are coming out of a fascist libretto or a fascist playbook. But let me start with this big question of what is new. And in order to ask what is new, we need, I think, at least in terms of my own expertise, to consider the distinctions, the connections, but also the distinctions between fascism and populism. Fascism, as an ideology, a movement, and a regime, took shape. Well, there are moments in the 19th century or even the 18th century which provide intellectual foundations for fascism, but fascism itself, as an ideology, a regime, and a movement, emerged in the context of the 20th century. That past century that created, by the way, I mean, a pandemic that we kind of ignore, or perhaps we didn't pay too much attention to it as historians, but also economic and political crisis, as well as situations of total war, violence, and repression. So fascism emerged out of that as a kind of response to something that happened then and happens now, which is what, you know, in history and politics and other fields we call a crisis of representation. And by that, just to put it simply, we should understand as a crisis of representation a situation where traditional political responses or traditional parties or traditional politicians are perceived by many members of the population, by many citizens, as not being up to the task, as not being the ones that can rule in a legitimate way. When that happens in the context of a democracy, there are different possibilities. Some possibilities involve perhaps a more, let's say, equal form of representation. It is clear that this happens when the elites are in power or elites have too much power. But fascism, as a response to that, actually had a very different response. The idea was that the solution for the problems raised by this crisis of representation or these elites was the creation of a dictatorship. So basically, if democracy had a problem, the fascists proposed to eliminate democracy in itself. So that was a dictatorial response to a democratic crisis of representation. And they did so by, in many ways. In many places, I mean, the most famous cases, of course, are those of Italy and Germany, where these fascist politicians and movements and leaders, they used democratic means to destroy democracy from within. So they came to power in, I would say, in legal democratic terms, and then they use they are positions to destroy democracy from within. In other cases, such as in Spain, fascists came to power by coup d'etat. And in other cases, such as, for example, Hungary or Romania, or France, fascists came to power with the help of other fascists, meaning, Nazis invaded those countries and put fascists in power. But in any case, when fascists were in power, as in all fascisms, 4 elements prevail. And these 4 elements, I mean, fascism is many things. I mean, even later on in the Q&A, perhaps we can engage in a conversation about it. But for, in order to be succinct, I would like to say that there are at least 4 key elements in fascism. One of them is violence. Violence as well as the glorification of violence. And here there is an interesting element which fascism provides, interesting and terrible element, by the way, and yet nonetheless original element, which is that as opposed to other forms of government, fascists believe that, of course, they believe that power is the monopoly of violence, but they also believe that power increases when that monopoly of violence is exercised against the preconceived enemies of the fascists. So that is to say that a powerful state or a powerful movement or a powerful leader, all of them are more powerful when they exercise violence. And this is, of course, in terms of other political traditions, it's certainly different. The idea that in order to be powerful, you need to be violent and glorify violence is, it's a little bit different from other liberal or even socialist or conservative traditions. So violence being one element. The other element, which takes, of course, center stage, is racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination. Fascist politics put racism at the center. The other element, which is the one that I recently wrote about in my last book, which is A Brief History of Fascist Lies, is a way of lying and a propaganda apparatus that radically breaks with other political traditions. In the sense that, of course, all political traditions are, to put it simply, all politicians lie, or most of them lie, but most of them do not believe in their lies, or most of them do not believe that lying is at the service of a transcendental truth that cannot be corroborated by facts, and in fact transcends facts. So this way of lying is specific to fascism, and specific to fascism is this kind of propaganda apparatus which someone like Goebbels made famous. So far we have 3 elements, which are violence, racism, lies. And in terms of violence, racism, and lies, the differences are not only quantitative, but also qualitative, in the sense that fascism ascribes total value to them. They are not means, but often they are ends for the fascists. And the last element is dictatorship. I mean, it's a political system that radically breaks with the democratic tradition in order to create a totalitarian state where there is no difference between what is public and what is private, and there is no difference between, or no distinction between, the state and the public sphere. In fact, the public sphere is eliminated, or almost eliminated. And all institutions of the states resemble and follow the will of the leader, and certainly there is no independent press. So that is fascism in a nutshell. When fascism is defeated after 1945, populist regimes emerge. Of course, other regimes emerge. But within the democratic tradition, and especially first in Latin America and then in other places, there are people on the right, on the extreme right, former dictators and fascists, that somehow understand that the ways of fascism need to be reformulated, that certain key elements of fascism, including these elements that I have just mentioned, became toxic in politics after the defeat of the fascist powers of the Axis, and they kind of reformulate fascism in a democratic key. And fascism in a democratic key, it might sound like an oxymoron, because, I mean, fascism cannot be democratic. So basically, that's the point, that these former fascists and dictators cease to be fascists and start to be populist, in the sense that they incorporate other authoritarian elements of fascism to what I call an authoritarian form of democracy, but an authoritarian form of democracy that still is lacking these key elements of fascism. That's why populism is not fascism, I say, but rather a reformulation of fascism. And the result of that is an authoritarian form of democracy. This is not, I mean, an authoritarian form of democracy where you have, important elements of fascism, such as the idea that the leader is more important than the rest, the idea that there is no distinction between the leader and the state. You have forms of corruption that resemble fascism and so on, but you have left behind dictatorship, violence, the propaganda lies technique, and racism. This doesn't mean that populists were not often either racist or violent, but rather that this was not at the center of their politics. And this, to some extent, was the history of populism, let's say, between 45 and the early 21st century. Even if you go to people that resemble the current populists, like, let's say, Silvio Berlusconi, or if you want to take examples from other traditions, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, none of these characters were essentially racist. None of these characters were as violent as the fascists were in the past, and so on and so forth. So this is a question of what happens now. And what happens now is that there is a new brand, a new kind of cadre of populist politicians, which have, and these populist politicians have left behind basically the populist rejection of fascism by way of recuperating some of these elements that used to be not populist by fascists. And to me, like this is almost 4 years ago, or actually more than 4 years ago, when President Donald Trump launched his campaign with a racist diatribe against Mexicans, he put an element that populists typically would not put at the center of their politics. He put it at the center of his politics, insofar as this was the key element in the launching of his campaign. So what's going on when racism, for example, appears as a central part of the picture? Are we seeing fascism, or are we seeing populism as it as it was in the past? Now, the point is that what we need to ask ourselves is like, okay, what's going on, and which are the elements that seem to have been repressed in the past and they have returned? And to use a Freudian metaphor, like, this is the return of what was repressed, and what was repressed implies violence and the lack of, let's say, and the lack of reason. And this is what we are seeing. I mean, in fact, it's not as opposed to basically his own tendency to present himself as the center of everything. I mean, Trump is not that original. We are seeing similar patterns in India. We are seeing similar patterns in Brazil, and we are seeing similar patterns in Hungary and other places. So this new brand of populist politicians, which are also post-fascist, want to, let's say, return to key elements of fascism that earlier populists had left behind. So let's analyze the elements. I already said racism, but if you think about Trump, you can easily answer like these kind of questions. I mean, what is the place of violence and the glorification of violence in Trumpism? What is the place of racism in Trumpism? And last but not least, what is the place of lies and a technique of propaganda that denies reality, and not only does that, but actually wants to change reality in order for reality to conform to the lies? What is the place of that in Trumpism? Or what is the place of that under the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil? And my own interpretation is that all these elements have a key place. And these elements are typically fascist, not populist. And yet we have the last element, and this is a discussion that I have been having, and probably you all have been having and even worried about, which is, I mean, and I will be a little bit concrete here. What happens if the president denies the result of elections and remains in power? And I think, having written a book on dictatorship myself, I will not hesitate to call the result of that rejection of a democratic election a dictatorship. And then, in terms of the history I have been telling, I would have then to say that in that case, we have racism at the center of politics, lies and a propaganda apparatus which are typical of Goebbels. Well, racism, violence, and last but not least, dictatorship. And in that sense, I think at this point, we can even think of the current situation as we are facing, I think, the danger of fascism or the danger of dictatorship. Having lived under dictatorship in the first years of my life, this is a story that I can not only analyze academically, but also in terms of my own experience. And this actually worries me even more. Now, do I have like 2 or 3 more minutes? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Indeed, please.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so, I mean, I would like to finish with a question that I have been asking myself, and I think you probably have been asking yourself, which is, what can we do? And the answer, of course, implies many things, and probably in different contexts, I will have myself a different answer. But if I have to, wear the hat of the historian here, the historian of fascism and populism, I will say, from a historical perspective, it is important that the mistakes of the past are not repeated now. And democracy needs to be defended. I don't think at this point that we can be apathic about what's going on. And the first dimension of that, of course, is that we need to vote. The second one is that it's important either to protest or to secure the place of protest in this society. Then it's important that the independent press remains so. And last but not least, and this is to some extent something that perhaps I'm not sure how much of this is under our control. But if history tells a lesson here, is that democracy failed also when people were apathic about that democracy or the need to defend that democracy, and either they didn't vote enough or they didn't protest enough, and they didn't defend or read perhaps the independent press. But the other dimensions are not under control to some extent, although we can exert some influence here, but perhaps a limited one. That, as you all know, when fascism won and was able to destroy democracy from within, is when conservatives and members of the right aligned themselves with the fascists, sometimes with the mistaken belief that they could control them, rather than with the constitution. And the same applies to the institutions of the state. And I mean the armed forces, the security forces, the judiciary, and other branches of the state. And this is to some extent something that I'm not so sure how much is under our control, but the situation will turn ugly also if these sectors do not learn from their mistakes and repeat what their predecessors did in countries like Germany and Italy. So, I mean, what can we do? A lot, and yet this is an open-ended situation. So I will finish with that.
Thank you, Federico, for combining acute analysis with impressive geographical breadth. I have 2 questions, and I'll ask them in succession. And once you finish, Michal will take over and manage chat, because my students tell me that I'm absolutely terrible at doing this. So the first is a specific question. As you well know, there's a, shall we say, a love-hate relationship between political scientists and historians, but both groups have now begun to ask the question, does the present, in all of the areas you've mentioned, but particularly in Europe and the United States, bear, if even tenuous, a relationship with the Weimar period? Is this historical analogy at all useful to us? If so, how do you see it useful? And if it's misleading, in what ways do you think it's misleading? That's the specific question. The second is a broader one. So we have gone in a remarkably short period of time from end of history euphoria to end of democracy pessimism. There isn't a day that I don't look up the New York Review of Books and there isn't an essay saying that we are at the tail end of democracy. And we see from, as you pointed out, from Brazil to Beijing by way of the United States, Europe, and India, similar patterns, authoritarian populist movements fascist tropes, democracy being called into question, the all-powerful leader being presented as the embodiment of the people, elections being called into question. How can you account for why this has come about so quickly? Are there commonalities that can help us understand what's going on in this vastly complicated and very different space? And finally, are the two categories, populism and fascism, which you began by drawing a very clear line between and then suggested are blended together now, can either of those help us in any way to figure out what we're seeing more or less worldwide? So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, these are very difficult questions and very important ones. And I mean, regarding, I mean, I wrote, I mean, this book, which is my previous book on From Fascism to Populism, as an attempt, and I thank you for your question, because I see the book as an attempt to bridge, let's say, the gaps between political science and history, other fields as well, but certainly these two, because whereas historians tend to analyze more fascism than populism, political scientists are more into populism than fascism. And they tend often to ignore the important contributions of each other. Of course, to the extent that I'm speaking, you know, from the perspective of an historian, I'm certainly biased as to, you know, as to the discussion. And sometimes I'm very critical of both history and political science. But the idea is that, I mean, to put it really simply, that political science, in my view, needs to know, I mean, needs to know more about the history behind the processes analyzing for the present, even to the extent that sometimes you hear arguments as if this only existed in the last 10 years or 20 years, or that this only happened in Europe or the US, and so on and so forth. And let's say, if you are Latin American, such as I am, you know, to hear that populism emerged in the last 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall is kind of strange. And the point is that, you know, when people like me that study other parts of the world, we know the histories of the West. I mean, we know the histories of the US and Europe, but sometimes the opposite is not necessarily true. And rather than being a critique, I also wrote the book in order to somehow fill that gap, because the book has a kind of a Latin American history to tell, as well as other regions. I mean, about populism in Asia or Africa, as much as I could, right? But I'm a Latin Americanist. So, I mean, I think there is an important dialogue between between history and political science in particular, and other fields in general, sociology as well, legal studies as well, and other fields. But so what can we learn from each other? Now, the Weimar question, I mean, if it's the problem with, you know, I think certainly it's important to think about what happened in Weimar. Now, if the question is taken literally, as sometimes is taken by some of the discussants, you know, on these issues, that's a problem, because obviously Weimar is not like the US. And obviously Trump is not like Hitler. I mean, this is obvious. Now, but if, I mean, the idea of having a comparison by somehow implying or prima facie claiming that A and B needs to be extremely similar or even identical is non-historical in that sense. Nothing is similar in that sense. And yet, what can we see as, you know, patterns in which patterns which are shared both in terms of, let's say, the way politics work, but also patterns that are shared ideologically through history and historical experiences. And sometimes the two of them are together. I mean, I think when you analyze somebody like Gorka or Miller, certainly, I mean, the history of fascist thought is important for this individual. So this is not really an abstract question, but rather a question about historical, let's say, intellectual traditions against democracy. And I think in that sense, there are ways to answer the question. My own way of answering the question about Weimar or fascism in general is that there are important distinctions, but yet it is startling that we are seeing important similarities. And in addition to that, traditions which are often shared by these groups. I mean, I mean, fascism, of course, did not disappear after 1945, But populists often thought, I mean, and I'm thinking, for example, of people like Getulio Vargas in Brazil or Juan Perón in Argentina, they often thought that the fascists were toxic for politics. So they didn't want to do anything with the fascists. Although, you know, someone like Perón, who had been a fascist, he had like, you know, he liked them in his, you know, in the, let's say, inner depths of his heart, but explicitly he didn't want to have anything to do with these guys because he believed that they were toxic. I mean, for the public, let's say. The same happened with racism or, for example, anti-Semitism. So if you compare that with what you see, for example, in the US or in Brazil, in which you have basically what you might call a kind of alliance between a populist in power like Trump with fascist fellow travelers. I mean, neo-Nazis, people armed with weapons, paramilitary groups that should be defined in terms of what they are, which are fascist groups. And these are not certainly rejected by the president. And someone like Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi in India will often do like engage in little gestures, praising them or accepting them or normalizing them, or even enabling their violence. So we are seeing a very different situation from the past, and a situation that takes us back to the violence, to a violence that existed not only in the Weimar period, but also in places in Latin America before the coup d'etats. And what happened, I mean, what made this possible, and this is going back to your second question about the current, now I think I cannot see. Oh, okay. Going back to the second question about the current concerns or even pessimism about democracy, is that when democracy ended, when democracy was finished, it's because people did not have faith in the workings of democracy. I mean, that's why I started with this idea of the crisis of representation, which is either created or believed. And when democracy is not defended, this is when authoritarians can defeat it. So my point is that I think these fears about, or even pessimism about democracy being challenged or threatened, I mean, I think they are very concrete fears. I don't think this is a paranoia at all. Now, sometimes you have the opposite argument saying like populists or post-fascists like Trump or Bolsonaro or Orban are not good in responding to a crisis which is a more natural crisis, let's say, like such as the one with the coronavirus. And I entirely disagree with that. I think they have been doing, in a way, a terrible job with their countries, but a good job in trying to use this to maintain themselves in power, even though they are widely rejected. And this is a scary part for me. And here, I think here the role of lies is another element which takes us back to not only to Weimar, but to fascism, which emerged after Weimar.
Federico, may I just step in
Go ahead, please.
Clarify the second question, which I may not have stated clearly. What strikes me, and not just me, many people, is that in this arc from Brazil to Beijing, if you look closely at these countries, they are very different in demography, religion, size, natural resources, political order. You couldn't find a more diverse set of societies. But in a remarkably short time, in ways that very few people had predicted, there are common currents sweeping through these regions. Are you surprised by that A, it happened? B, are you surprised by the rapidity with which it happened? And can we account for the fact that broadly similar things are occurring in countries that are so different?
Yes, I will restrict myself to the cases, I mean, because authoritarianism, or let's say, and dictatorship exist throughout the world and throughout history. And I will restrict myself to the cases that I know the most or understand better, which are those of right-wing, let's say, post-fascist leaders that want to challenge democracy as it was and perhaps even destroy it. And here I will talk about, again, India, Brazil, Hungary. There are other cases, of course, Brazil and the United States. As a citizen, I'm surprised. If I go back to what I know as a historian, I am less surprised. I mean, it doesn't mean that every time I read what's going on, I'm surprised. I'm surprised that democracy is not stronger. I'm surprised that these people can get away with all this. As an historian, if I go back to what happened in the past, I see that this happened, that similar things happened before. And going back to, let's say, the most optimistic dimension of my presentation, I would say, which is perhaps, I hope it sounded a little bit optimistic, even if it was not to some extent at different points, is that what can we do? And again, like we know, it's important to understand that in some cases democracy was destroyed all of a sudden, such in Germany, or in fascist Italy it took 3 years or almost 4 for Mussolini to destroy that democracy. In my own country, in Argentina, the coup d'etat in a matter of days destroyed democracy and started doing things which were inspired by fascism, by the history of fascism. And nothing happened, or not much could be done. Now, what is interesting is that, of course, when it happens, if democracy is destroyed, it's much more difficult to resist. It's much more difficult. Not impossible, but much more difficult. So the question is, what can we do now? And it's an open question. It's not that I have the answer or even, let's say, operative answers in terms of what can we really do, but certainly we should stick with these foundations of democracy. And I have to tell you, even when one might think that this is obvious, it's not. The history of Weimar or the history of my country, Argentina, show that people were kind of apathic about defending a democracy that they saw as being dominated by elites or not responding to their concerns. But what happened afterwards was even worse, was a dictatorship that certainly was not identified with the concerns and sufferings of a majority of citizens. So, yeah. I couldn't hear you.
I keep forgetting about this unmute business. It's a tribute to you, Federico, as well as to the energy on our campus, intellectual energy, and to the Rifkind Center, that we have about close to 90 people participating and already about 12 questions queued up. So my duties are done. I'm going to pass the baton to Professor Michal Deckel, but I do want to thank you once again for coming and giving us the benefit of your wisdom. It's good to see you all, albeit virtually. Michal.
Good to see you, and thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raj, for your questions. Federico, since the theme of our Rifkind Center seminar this year is pandemic, and we did want to speak a little bit more about the pandemic and populism. I was wondering if you could, I mean, I know you touched on it, if you could talk a little bit more about that, about the different iterations and responses of around the globe of different populist leaders, and also, I mean, other historical examples of this sort of marriage between populism and a natural crisis or a pandemic or so on that you can talk about?
Well, I mean, I would like to I mean, this question can be answered in so many ways. I would like to just take the issue of lies, because one key element of some of these leaders' response to the pandemic has been trying to lie their way out of the pandemic, so to speak, which has, I mean, I don't think it is a coincidence that countries like Brazil, India, and the United States are the countries with most victims of the virus. I mean, those high numbers are also an outcome of this idea coming out of the fascist tradition of rejecting reality when dealing with an actual crisis, and thinking or even behaving as if the lies could counteract a reality. Meaning, you have a virus, don't wear masks, drink bleach. I mean, another stuff that has been said, which in the case of Brazil was interesting because Bolsonaro was denying the virus. He said it was a little flu, and then again, at one point, he became positive with the virus. in the case of Trump, we see similar things. And this is a question of, it seems like ages ago, but I think last week or 10 days ago, there was another scandal out of the many, which was that there were recordings that the president admitted that he had lied about the virus, in the sense that he, in private, admitted that the virus was a very important matter, while in public he was denying the seriousness or the importance of the virus. And yet this is the same person that in most occasions still refuses to wear a mask. I mean, actually endangering others, but also himself. And so to some extent, these are lies that I think these characters believe. And when they don't believe them, they believe they are the service of a larger truth, and this truth having nothing to do with reality, but rather with their own leadership. Let's say the truth is that the leader prevails. As the fascist said, Mussolini is always right. And in that sense, the response to the virus through the denial of reality had a very, the opposite, I mean, had at least two consequences. That in fact, in many ways, the reality became worse. And somehow, and this might not be enough, somehow, all this lying was catching up. And if we read numbers or polls, apparently this is one of the concerns that most citizens have, that this mishandling of the coronavirus crisis. Now, as you know, in the history of Nazism, you have similar patterns. Hitler was lying about world domination, and he was lying that they will win the war. And even the most fanatic Nazis, by, perhaps too late, by the end of, let's say, 44 and early 45, when bombs were killing their friends and family and destroying their homes, they ceased somehow to believe in the lies of the leader. At some point, as I said in one thing that I wrote, they saw the emperor for who he was, which is a naked liar, a naked person, right? So they didn't see the robes. Now, the question is, was it too late? Certainly it was too late for the majority of European Jews, which were exterminated by the Nazis. And it was too late in this case for the victims of the virus. Now, will this be enough? Certainly, I think the election to some extent is competitive because of all this, the bad response to the coronavirus by leaders such as Trump or Bolsonaro. At the same time, part of that response is denying that denial of reality involves denial of actual existing norms and democratic traditions in this country. So we run the risk of the opposite. We run the risk of, as I said before, we run the risk of democracy being even more in danger. So whether the crisis is good or not for this kind of leaders, I think is, from a historical point of view, I cannot engage. It's too soon to tell. As a citizen, I have to say, I'm extremely concerned, and we need to respond to this as much as we can.
Federico, I want to, I'm turning to some of the questions, but which are in some ways a continuation of Roger's questions and my questions. And I want to press you again and again about this question of why now, right? So why do we see these phenomena across the globe now? We had when, Hitler was supported by Mussolini. During the war period, we saw kind of real alliances, right? There were actual alliances, as well as occupations. But what is the connection between Orban and Modi? Why in seemingly completely disparate places that have no connection are very similar phenomena and discourses arising?
Well, first we have to, as historians, we need to take the long view, in the sense that if things are happening now, we need to assume that they were happening before as well. So that Trump is able, for example, to use racism in America and to be successful in that sense is also involves a long history of racism in this country. The difference, of course, is that this was not as explicitly put from a position of power as of recently in American history from the White House. Racist candidates in this country we had before. The campaign of George Wallace, which we see in my seminar on fascism and populism with my students. We analyze it. I mean, that's very much looking like this, but those people never won. So to some extent, we see a change in that sense as well, right? That these positions, which were at some point not acceptable, became normalized and more acceptable. And again, it depends on where you focus. I mean, through, for example, the fantastic book of Ziblatt and Levitsky, we see, for example, that this also happens because elites have been changing, and specifically in the Republican Party, they identify or they fear the leader more than they identify with the Constitution and democratic norms. So this kind of betrayal of the elites, this change in the political culture of the country, of course, has older patterns, but becomes something different once a person like Trump is in power. I think another, I mean, there are so many dimensions to analyze this, and I think it's almost unfair to do so in an answer which needs to be brief. But the last element I wanna mention is that this type of lying has mythical and religious connotations, because the truth that is presented as the let's say as the opposite of the opposite of let me put it simply, like what people like Trump regard as lies, in fact, are truth, as you know, which can be empirically proven. What they regard as the truth is a truth in the leader, and is a truth of faith, meaning that this is part of a cult and is part of a political religion, which is quite radical. So this is another element, that the moment in which you have this kind of mythical, mystic, and pseudo-religious views being part of these new politics of the state, well, you see also a change vis-a-vis the past. And yet, as you know, I mean, like this kind of lack of separation between the secular, I mean, between the state and religion in America and other places have existed before. So I think it's a perfect storm where dimensions that existed before have been intensifying. I mean, let's return to violence, racism, lies, the place of, let's say, cult-like characteristics for voting a candidate or following a leader, and so on and so forth.
So do you think the rhetoric is sort of migrates, let's say, from Modi to Orban to Bolsonaro to, I mean, even to Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, I mean, certainly you see similar patterns of behavior, similar ideas against liberal democracy and the independence of institutions, similar acts of corruption, similar fanatism vis-a-vis the place of, you know, the leader and religion, because of course you see a conflation between the leader and God, even to the extent that in this country a couple of weeks ago said that a Biden victory will hurt God. And you see this total conflation, because we know that a Biden victory will hurt Trump for sure, but God, and so on and so forth. But I mean, this kind of language which existed before, I think is taking center stage, and to some extent, then we need to talk about a qualitative change. I mean, today a senator, I think Senator, I think the name is Blackburn, or said that no atheistic person can be in the Supreme Court. And what kind of statement is that, you know, from a senator? I mean, and of course, the entire question is problematic insofar as it places a role for religion that, as far as I know, is not in the Constitution. So we see these attempts to really, you know, reroute this democracy in ways that are extremely authoritarian. If not, if we believe what, you know, Trump's word about not recognizing the results of election, if not dictatorial, even more than authoritarian. So, and that is I mean, we see both a change, but also the radicalization of patterns which obviously existed before. Now, why, if you ask me, why is that? The answers are like, I mean, they can multiply and also are related to national traditions. So why now in the US? Why now in Israel? Why now in India? There are global dimensions as well as particular national trajectories, no?
Yes.
I mean, my point is, like, just to say the last thing, like in my own country, in Argentina, which has a long history of fascism and populism, you don't see, this brand of populism almost doesn't exist so far. And I think it is like why fascism or racism is still toxic, even for the Argentine right to basically present it that in a way that is more typical of Trump and Bolsonaro. I think it relates to how recent and how strong our memory of our last dictatorship is in our country. Whereas in countries like the US, perhaps in countries like Israel or or other places, this idea of dictatorship is a kind of vague concept rather than a lived experience. I mean, it is not, let's say, a couple of years ago, it would have been unthinkable to see the extreme right as successful as it is in countries like Germany, Spain, or Italy. But the more these countries are relegated, or the more actually they downplay how terrible and even miserable the experience of dictatorship was for them, the more for these kind of ideas to be successful in the political sphere.
I'll read some questions. What role, if any, do you see economics playing in the rise of more fascistic forms of populism? In part because it seems that if what we're saying is a global phenomena, there may be global casual forces behind it, and economic structures and systems seem like they could be one such globalized driver.
Yes, I mean, the issue of fascism and economics is a tricky one, because fascism emerged before the economic crisis, and sometimes fascism thrives in good economic times, and sometimes fascism emerges out of economic crisis. So, I mean, it's not necessarily, let's say, a causal or it's not a determinant, I think, in that sense. And yet, we certainly need to think about the current crisis of representation, these ideas that elites in the capital do not represent the majority of citizens, are also related to neoliberal economics and increasing forms of inequality. I mean, and that is a global matter, although, as I was saying, in different countries, you find different responses. In the US, in India, or in Brazil, you find the response, which is, with German social democrats long time ago called the socialism of the imbeciles. Meaning that in terms of responding to actual economic issues of inequality, they propose to these disenfranchised voters, they propose, let's say, racist ideas to them. Like, your economic situation will not be better, but you are a superior race, or as the president said, you have superior genes, or you have good genes, or whatever he meant by that. And we know what he meant. So the point is that will the issues be resolved by spreading hate and racism? Of course not. But this is what they do.
Somebody wrote, some analysts talk about the Trumpization of the world. And I do wonder whether you think Trump as a figure has a disproportionately large role in all of this, or is he part of just like this sort of synchronic global phenomena? And this person is asking, she's saying, I think that Alvaro Vélez from Colombia was a pioneer in this populist turning fascist. What are your thoughts on him? So I guess maybe on Trump's role, and also on Vélez from Colombia being, I guess this person is suggesting one of the first ones, or a pioneer in this turn to this new fascism.
Well, I mean, regarding the Trumpification, I mean, Trump would like to, actually, in typical Trumpist ways, he defines the current moment as, I quote, the age of Trump. And to what extent that's true, I mean, it's a matter of course, interpretation. And those of us that do not work specifically in the US need to put some question marks on that idea. I mean, these forms of racism, these forms of violence and xenophobia existed in Brazil or in India before Trump, certainly in Europe before Trump, and so on and so forth. People like Matteo Salvini or certainly Bolsonaro were active in politics many years, if not decades, in the case of Bolsonaro, before Trump entered politics. So, I mean, to that extent, rather than an inspiration, Trump appears as a kind of confirmation of ideas that existed throughout. I mean, dictatorial ideas, violent ideas, pro-fascist ideas, and racist ideas, and so on. Now, he plays no small role because the fact that he is at the helm of the most powerful country on earth has normalized these post-fascist ideas to a big extent and has provided cover and legitimacy to these leaders. I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil has been very influenced by Trump in that sense, taking cover and showing that, look, this happens in such a venerable democracy as the US. This is okay. This is cool for Brazil as well. But of course, they downplay the fact that, of course, that the American democracy is also in danger. So the answer is yes, he has been very influential, but he's not the one that originated this. Rather, his triumph provided cover and legitimacy to things that existed before throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of Vélez in Colombia being a kind of pioneer of this turn?
Well, I talk about, like in my book, From Fascism to Populism, I talk about Álvaro Uribe and Colombia. And I mean, to some extent, when he was president, he kind of belonged to what I see as a different type of populism, a kind of neoliberal populism typical in Latin America, but also in Italy, with people like Carlos Menem in Argentina, Fujimori in Peru, and Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador, and many others. Now, what is interesting about the Uribe case is that he resorted to the use of violence and the paramilitary, which were not necessarily typical of the populism of that era. And in that sense, you could say that, I mean, I will agree with the idea that he was a kind of promoter of things that eventually will become the normal. Like we are seeing clips all over the place of basically groups masquerading as soldiers. I mean, basically paramilitary groups. I will not call them militia. I will call them paramilitary groups. People in soldier costume with real weapons. And that sounds like very fascist to me, as well as very much what happened in Colombia before. So, I mean, I think, yes, like we can learn a lot from the Colombian case. But again, I wouldn't say that Trump was studying Uribe and that's why he became Trump. But certainly we see a pattern that eventually, I think, was radicalized by someone like Trump or Bolsonaro.
Someone is asking, are we seeing Latinx communities in the US in a precarious position of siding with populism given glaring divisions of class, race, and illegal status?
Well, I mean, I think sadly we have in the history of victims of this type of regimes and types of leaders, we have segments of the population that do not see it that way, and they believe that that this is not about us. I mean, for example, I am from Argentina, and in Argentina, some people will say, no, Trump hates Mexicans. They don't hate Argentines or Ecuadorians or whatever. And sometimes what they don't understand is what Trump means by Mexicans is Latin Americans or Hispanics or Latinx. And basically, the point that certain groups believe that they are not being targeted doesn't mean that they will not be targeted. I mean, this reminds me of, when probably you know the story that like when the Nazis invaded France, some members of the French Jewish community were telling the occupying forces and the French government, look, we are French. You should go after Jews which are not French. And of course they were wrong. I mean, because it was against all of them. So the point is that at some point you could even, I mean, sorry to use a very strong word, but I think just at some points, as Hannah Arendt suggested, like we should even talk about collaborators. I mean, if a group is being targeted and there are people that actually contribute with, with those that are enabling racists or even being racist themselves, how do you call members of that group?
Someone is asking, my question is writing, given your personal experience with fascism, if the US becomes a fascist dictatorship, will you leave? I guess this is a question for for all of us.
I'm hoping that
Yeah.
that will not be
Yeah.
the case, and this is the optimistic part of me. I mean, I'm hoping that I do not have to think about that terrible decision. And you know, part of this decision, I mean, or part of that question is, I mean, and I tell you this in terms of what I know of fascism, is that sometimes when fascism happens, you don't have that choice. I mean, this is what fascism is about, and it's certainly not about the freedom of movement. Now, I'm optimistic. I don't think this will happen, but I certainly think that is a possibility. And again, Andreas, I mean, I'm sorry that I cannot read like very well all the chats, but I saw a question from Andreas at some point that said that you wanted to push me more on what to do. And
Can I elaborate?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I understand you correctly, you see you see these contemporary movements, whether they're fascist or populist or neo-fascist or post-fascist, whatever they are, as a threat to democracy. I mean, I think we have to understand their success, their popularity is in some sense a symptom of a sense of disillusionment with democracy, right? Perhaps even exhaustion with democracy in some parts of the world. In your initial remarks, you said that the response to this needs to be voting, protest, securing the freedoms of the press, basically more democracy. So I guess my question is, does democracy need to be rethought, or does some kind of new what exactly is the form of democracy that can respond in a robust way to this crisis that calls into question its very existence?
Well, I mean, certainly one should, I mean, by defending democracy, I don't mean defending, let's say, the moments in which actually democracy is not being achieved. Because if there is so much inequality, if there is so much difficulty, for example, in attending a university, or so much difficulty on getting healthcare or being educated, how democratic that is. And I think, that certainly there is a lot to do in terms of expanding democracy rather than accepting it as it was before. But now we are being threatened by attempts to downplay, minimize, or even perhaps destroy democracy. So, I mean, I don't think we should take democracy for granted. On the other hand, it's not that I would celebrate exactly what we had before. We need to do much more in order for people, I mean, even people that somehow identify with the cult of the leader, to understand that their problems are not related to the victimization of others, if they can. And eventually, my point is that from the history of fascism is that when these kind of people that are into the cult eventually understand that they were fooled, sometimes it's too late. Certainly it was too late for the European Jews. When most Germans by the early 50s realized that Hitler had been wrong, I mean, the Jews were killed. So my point is that it might be too late then. Now, again, it's a possibility. And going back to, look, the history of populism as a reformulation of fascism tells you that most populists, they don't like it, but when they lose, they go. And perhaps Trump hopefully will behave like a typical populist and not like a typical fascist. But that remains to be seen. And I think the hardest the choice becomes for him, then the more you can make him more of a populist rather than a fascist. My point is that how difficult it will be for a person like that in this or any other country to not play by the rules and destroy democracy. If it's difficult, eventually that person might behave like a populist. Because when populists in history lost, they just didn't like it but left. And this is the history of populism as well. Now, the history of fascism is a different story. They don't like to lose. They don't like to leave power, and that's why they are dictators and enforce dictatorship. Now, I think it's very soon to tell, but I don't think it's up only to a person to make the decision. I mean, for example, how difficult this decision could be if there is a landslide. Probably very difficult, meaning if people vote. how difficult this decision will be if, let's say, different sectors of society express their disagreement with this choice. And by the way, that wasn't the case in Weimar or in Nazi Germany or in Fascist Italy, that many people were apathic. Apathic, of course, because sometimes democracy didn't work for them. But instead of asking for more democracy, they just ignored the fact that democracy was going to be finished, and what happened was not necessarily good for them. It was good for the dictators and their cronies. So I think the situation is open-ended. And the good part is that in many ways it's up to us to decide.
I think we can open maybe the floor and just have people ask questions.
Of course.
We have a few, rather than me reading the questions and so on, we have about, I don't know, 10 minutes or a little bit over. So if you, I guess raise your hand so I can see you if you want to ask something. Let me see if I see people. It's so hard to see everybody at the same time. Or maybe we just talk then if I don't see you.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was asking earlier, can you speak to the Hong Kong effect in states like Florida, for instance, that is trying to pass very quickly an anti-protest bill that is nearly identical to what China put into effect in Hong Kong. They're trying to get it passed before the election for obvious reasons that will criminalize protests. I'm sorry, I don't know who it was who made this point earlier in regards to approaching fascism with just more democracy, like applying more democracy. We can't, if we have more of these bills going through that criminalizes protest is obviously not an avenue for us. Wouldn't a dictatorship of Trump require a stronger response than simply protesting from the people?
What do you mean by a stronger response?
A revolution.
Well, there is a point I can answer to you historically, because at some point there is a part of the question that it becomes kind of normative in terms of what we think politically. And of course, that's totally fair, but I don't think that my opinion is more informed than others at all. So what I'm a little bit informed is about what happened before. And generally, when democracy was not defended, when democracy existed, then it was very late to respond to an authoritarian state, because the state owned, let's say, as I said before, the monopoly of violence and the means of repression, and they were not hesitant to repress any form of disagreement. So my point is that we are not in a stage where we cannot, let's say, use democratic means to contest the attempts against democracy.
Thank you.
Federico, I'm wondering if you could speak to the role of social media in the creation of this new proto-fascism.
Well, they have been very adept at using social media. Again, this is to some extent new, but we know from, that right-wing groups, historically, they have been actually really good in using new technologies to spread their message of hate, of violence, and repression. Hitler himself used planes. And remember, by the way, when the president said or thought that he was being very original doing political acts next to his plane, actually that's what Hitler did all the time. Mm-hmm. And he could be in different cities, the same day, spreading his message. And they were using, of course, as you know, radio and cinema to advance their message. And now they are using, all these social media platforms. And they use them in a way that shows that, that they are not necessarily, certainly now, almost nobody can be as naive as to say that the existence of social platforms democratizes the public sphere. Sometimes it's the opposite, because it kind of levels the field in which every opinion is the same, either a lie or an informed opinion based on facts. Everything is the same, and it becomes a matter of perspective. And I think the Italian thinker Umberto Eco raised this issue perhaps very bluntly when he said, with the internet, sometimes, I mean, he was very blunt. He said sometimes that the town's idiot that nobody cared about, the drunk who was there and saying stupid things and nobody listened to, now that person has a big platform and becomes as legitimate as people that study or people that base themselves on facts. And now the dimension of that, and a dimension of that which explains why the hatred for independent journalism is that precisely in this kind of new media landscape, there is this insistence by these right-wing groups that everything is a matter of perspective. And the hatred for independent journalism is that, in fact, they play the key role of giving us facts to have our own opinions. So the place of facts in society is leveled, the place of facts or evidence is minimized, and democracy suffers as a result. So, I mean, I certainly one should not, I mean, but you might remember that a couple of years ago, many pundits thought that platforms such as Twitter or Facebook were great for democracy. Not necessarily. What is great for democracy is the content and the practice of the message, not the messaging, not the function or the platform.
Maybe one last question. Anybody wants to jump in?
About how Trump doesn't want people to wear masks, and I see that as like a religious display of devotion. Like you mentioned, that he tries to deny facts, and I'm wondering, like how dangerous is this like religious movement, especially now that we have like QAnon, that's like giving like a whole worldview to the believers, and it seems like it's just a way to set apart to show people who believes in Trump and who doesn't.
Yeah, I think it's very dangerous. And the issue is not religion itself. The problem is the displacement of religion or religious forms of thinking into politics. So you have this kind of distortion of religion, which appears now as a kind of political movement with a leader that acts like a god. And if you see, for example, The Triumph of the Will, this famous Nazi movie by Leni Riefenstahl, you see that Hitler appears like a god, not like a normal person. And when you have that kind of politics, let's say the horizon of violence gets closer and closer to us. Because when you don't agree with the godlike figure, what are you, according to this religious mindset? Well, you are an infidel, you are a traitor to God, or certainly you don't have legitimacy in terms of being different, of thinking differently, behaving differently, or speaking differently. So this is, what this, let's say, cult-like form of politics provides is a very fanatic way of identifying with the self, with the group, and a very easy kind of slippery slope to hate and discriminate others. So this is not, how can I say, this is not healthy, or this is not good for democracy, not about, other political traditions. As I said, all political traditions involve lies, and they involve, I guess, success and also failures. But my point is, I'm talking about fascism, because fascists believe in these ideas in religious ways and ways that are not similar to other political traditions. Sadly, I think this is the case that we are witnessing right now. So this is a book about fascist idea. My last book, certainly, this book, History of Fascist Lies, is about fascist lies and the way fascists lie, which is sadly having a lot of resonance in the present.
Thank you so much, Professor Federico Finkelstein. Thank you, Professor Raj Menon. Thank you, members of the Rifkind seminar and all our other guests. And as I said before, follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on our website for events. We have maybe 10 events this year, all related in one way or another to the current situation. And we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
The imperialist regime of the United States federal government will